Okay, I want to go over the work you had from week 2 and look at some of your responses and then try to put that in context with the readings and some additional ideas. So I wanted to start you off with the civic education gap so that you could kind of get a good idea of what you're expected to do in this course, and also, just to acknowledge that, you don't know everything, especially when it comes to the legal system and the Supreme Court and constitutional law, and that you're not alone, that's common among most Americans. And this is a big deal, right? So one of the things that Kingsborough has been trying to do for the last 10 years is to try to close that gap, right? So to try to make opportunities available to students and the community to better understand civic engagement, and especially our political processes, legal processes, and some of the big social issues. And so there's a graduation requirement that you may or may not have known about, but if you look at your CUNY first, you'll see that it says this course satisfies your graduation requirement. So, what does that mean? What is it we're supposed to do? So the definition here that we're all working from is that it really is focused on an education that is going to bring you more social awareness or awareness of social issues. You're going to start to think about your responsibility to society and to others, and you're going to start to think about how do you actively participate in meeting the challenges that we're all going through. This is based on the idea that there's a mutual responsibility to care, so it's not just you off on your own island, it's you engaged in this community that we all live in. And you can do this through political activity, voting, right, running for office, supporting a local politician, complaining to a community board, right, lots of different ways to do that. Community service, which some of you I know are probably already doing, serving people in your own community, people and sometimes managing health care and child care for family members. Also in leadership opportunities, right, that come up either at work, or on campus, or in some of those community service locations. But you could also do it by learning about issues and then starting to be an advocate for those issues, as simple as putting something with a hashtag on your social media, and more complicated and actually getting out of your house and engaging with other human beings to make a change. And so what we're supposed to do, or what I'm supposed to do, is to make sure that you're getting an awareness of these issues and that you're getting opportunities to deepen and learn some new skills to help you actively participate in their communities. And so part of your grade is going to be based on how well you show your ability to start to think about these issues. And so what we're trying to do is we're going to connect the knowledge from the field, the discipline of criminal justice as a criminal justice major, to problems with everyday practice that law enforcement officers go through, lawyers, judges, and corrections officers, so you kind of see what those problems are and you can start to think about what kind of reforms are necessary and what you can do to participate in that process. Now, it's a little bit easier for us, right, as criminal justice majors, because there's so much going on civically engaged wise, and so by you going and getting a degree and looking at institutions and trying to figure out how to make changes in those institutions to make them better, you're kind of already engaged in this process. But we want to make sure we're connecting that to your own personal life, your own personal views of politics and government, and that gives you kind of a richer experience. So this really starts with you learning how to analyze rather than just read and remember, right? You have to get a little bit deeper than that, do some critical thinking, but also sharing your opinions and engaging with others, largely in this class, the discussion board, on issues that have to do with race, ethnicity, class, gender, language, sexual orientation. I'd probably add, religion in here and some other categories, but differences, right? Inequalities that come from the differences that we have, especially in a city like New York City. And so specifically within this class, you're going to be able to describe the tension between laws, social control, and law's rights. Many of you have done that already on a discussion board. You're going to be able to describe how law is used as a tool for social change. There's some of that coming up, some of the cases, and also talking about how groups have tried to use law. It also talks about the limitations and how sometimes it doesn't always work. You're going to get that in the Paradox of Rights from the Michael McCann reading. You're also going to start to learn how to describe how judges interpret constitutional text, so the words of the Constitution, but as well as previous cases that they're looking at, and how they tend to think about or don't think about historical structural controversies, and these include racism, criminal justice intersectionality, and modern challenges of the state administration. Those are all broken up in your textbook by those categories. So you're really seeing how judges do that through those words, the words that they use, right? This is why you can't in this class just simply go online and see, what was the outcome of the case, right? Good to know. Hopefully the information is right. I'd say about 50% of the time it's not. But it's good to know the outcome of the case, but you need to know more than that to pass this class and to be civically engaged and to do well in your major, of course. And then now you're going to think about how, you're going to learn this isn't just natural. It isn't what it is. It's more about how the system has been designed and that it creates contradictions, right? It creates these gaps and makes it harder for certain groups to achieve justice and to get equality. And the way that would look, right, is that, you'd move away from this pink column and move towards the green column, right? So instead of saying that, everybody just interprets things however they want, right? Not a very thoughtful or research-based opinion. Or you say something like, it's just whatever somebody chooses to do, right? That they can just decide to be good or they can decide to be bad. Or you might just, look online, you find some Google definition of law, which, Google hasn't read the textbook and hasn't read any of the cases, but the people have put up there, they've got some definition, and you say, oh, well, here's this definition, everybody's got to follow the rules or else there'll be consequences. Well, I challenge you, then go ahead and, ask Google next, what is a rule? How do you know there's a rule that's been a rule? What's an exception to a rule? What if somebody doesn't know the rule, right? There's all these questions that once you start doing analysis and critical thinking, you'd say, wow, this answer is not very good. That's why it's a D, right? And so a best answer would be, you'd start to say, wow, you know what? Interpretations of the Constitution in previous cases are happening in different cases. So I'm going to start to look at that, and I'm going to describe how the judges apply different reasoning. What reasons do they give for their different interpretations? And you'll start to see that law is much more than just a simple rule, that there's a whole lot going on there. And so your struggle will be kind of going, probably in the C and B category as you're learning how to do this, right? So by the end of the class, you're going to want to be able to see the different systemic outcomes because of this different reasoning, and because we live in a unequal society. So how are we doing so far? Well, I've shared through Blackboard, and I'm doing it here again, what I think is a great answer, right? Of not only just following directions, which is super important, and many of you do struggle with that. So please, 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 right? Take your time and make sure you're following the directions. You won't get credit for answers that don't follow directions. But this answer goes beyond the directions, right? And also offers some critical analysis for us. And so, they use the textbook references, but then also help us understand why it matters. And so I want you to be able to recognize the gap between everyday people, you, and experienced scholars and practitioners of law, me, judges, lawyers, right, practitioners, and how we think differently than you, right? It's not just because we know more, right, because we've been studying it more. It's also because we're socialized in these groups and we have different ways of thinking things. I grew up working class, but now that I've got my degrees and now I'm working for a long time and I'm doing better than I did when I was younger, it's harder for me to remember the struggles that I went through when I was younger. They don't completely go away, and some of them stick around, but it's not the same thing. I start to have a different way of thinking. I'm hanging out with different people, right? The world changes for you as an individual as you go through life, or sometimes it doesn't, right? Sometimes you're treated differently no matter where you go. And so these things are important to understand that gap so that we better understand how constitutional law really actually applies in the real world and not in some, fantasy world. So why does this matter? Well, the majority of people are everyday people. And they, according to our research, they show that they have expectations of rights that aren't really shared by those formalists, right? So the scholars, practitioners, the judges and lawyers, they don't focus on rights, right? So everyday people kind of think the Constitution is one thing and they're expecting the Supreme Court to do something, but that's not how the people in the court see the world. And so we need to understand, why is that? How can that change? Should it change, right? All these questions. The other thing is Supreme Court justices really don't understand what it's like to be you or I. They come from a very different background and they have a very privileged reality. And so it would be kind of silly for us to expect them to be on our side, right? But then how do we explain the judges who have, right? And that's interesting. That's an interesting question we have to explore. So what's next? Well, you need to learn how formalists think and how they apply the law. This is called legal reasoning. So you're going to learn how that happens, and you've already started doing that. Then you want to compare this kind of constantly, right, in your notes, talk to other people. What are your own expectations and probably the disappointments that will come from realizing that this gap is causing this problem and keeping inequality going. And this really has a lot to do with your identity, who you think you are, but also how others see you, including law enforcement and the legal system. You also want to look at historical examples of domination so we understand how this works over time. We also want to see how that creates resistances against unjust law, so we see this tension between the two. And we want to see, okay, so what's going on here between domination and resistance? How can things kind of lean towards equality as opposed to inequality, and what has been successful and what has not. We want to think of this contradiction as this concept called the malleability of law. Look in the definitions section of the textbook and try to memorize that. That's true of all of the definitions, right? But this one is particularly important. And then start to apply it as you're doing your reading. You say, oh, I see, right? Law is not just a set of rules. It's much more malleable. It's changeable. It changes based on the sides that are arguing in the court and everybody's kind of interpretations, as well as how everyday people think about it. Many layers to it. The other one thing you want to kind of keep thinking about, which will, at the end of the semester, will really zero in on, is this contradiction just natural? It's just the way things are? You know, just the Constitution came out of the ground and grows like a tree, and so of course it's going to be unequal. Obviously that's not correct, right? But that's how a lot of people think. And so you're going to see, well, how come that's not true? And you're really going to start to learn that this was designed to benefit property owners, white male slave holding. When we say property, we don't mean real estate, we mean slaves. White male slave holders, the whole system was designed to benefit them and exclude everyone else. And so because that hasn't changed, there's only been minor reforms, right? The system is still creating contradictions. So you'd have to have a revolutionary or radical change in the whole design of the system to promote something different. So how have you done this, right? Well, you've had a reading right off the bat in week 2 that talked about social inequality in the criminal justice system. So now you see how this applies in your major and in your likely chosen profession. So they gave you examples of the implicit bias in law enforcement. Same thing in prosecution and sentencing. So you see it's in different areas or different components of the system, but then it also repeats throughout the system. And this bias works against Black and Latinx people, mostly males, mostly young males, and against poor and working class people, against non-heteronormative sexual and gender-based identities, and some religious minorities as well. That's not talked about so much in the article, but that's also true. There's challenges this challenges your non-research based ideas, right? You came in probably thinking, well, people are good or bad, right? You didn't know yet about these systemic biases that hurt, or some of you may have already known, right? And so you're starting to make sense of this. How could this be true, right? How could there be ideals of the system being equal, and yet the reality is not only is it not equal, the same people who are supposed to be making equality are the ones making it unequal. And so a pretty great example here, right, is look how many white people use drugs, right? 50, that's a large number, 50%. And yet look how they're punished, right? Less than half of them are actually punished for their drug use, right? And yet look at the numbers for the other two groups, right? It's completely unfair. It's completely unequal. So what we want you to start to do is start to look at the patterns over time of socially constructed norms, right? Why are certain people being excluded generation after generation after generation, right? Who's producing the norms? Who's saying this is right and this is wrong? And then how does this affect people who aren't able to participate, right? They're not allowed to participate in either constructing laws, right? In making laws, in enforcing laws, or promoting the cultural norms, right? This is all connected. So because this is a civic engagement class and because you're a human being, we want you to think about what can you do? Well, you have to start with the idea that it's not natural. It's not what it is, right? That's a great Brooklyn saying, but it's not accurate in this particular situation, right? These things are produced, right? And part of the production is based in cultural production. in what you learned in school, what we learn in TV, right? What we just hear from everyday people. Again, remember, they're focused on rights, and so of course they want to think that the world is equal or that things are going to get better, because of course that's a good thing to think about. But that's not a research-based, right? That you don't need to go to college to start thinking about those things. College, you come here and you get introduced to the research, the scientific facts. And so you want to start, as you're making sense of this gap, you want to start to think, who's benefiting from this idea that the world is equal, or that law is equal, or that justice is blind, right? Who benefits from that? And then who loses from that? Who's getting hurt because of those myths? And let's think about this as this concept called hegemony, which again is in the reader and gives you a definition. And here's a picture of what hegemony looks like. So you've got what Gramsci calls the superstructure, or all of these components, right? Whether it's art, music, movies, just all the things that we think about as products of our culture. And then there's also how we work, right? And how everything is reinforcing our relations, right? So you have unequal relations in this class, right? So where does that come from? Well, it comes from the norms of the superstructure. We have these cultural norms that I should be in charge of you, right? Is that equal? No, of course not. So we have a violation, right? When you go to the workplace, who's in charge of you? The employer, right? Is that equal? No, of course. So here again, we have a violation. And again, this is not normal. This is not the way things work. This is because this is how it's produced. This is what the society, the cultural producers, this is what they've designed the system to be. So of course we participate in it, right? Until we start critically analyzing it. Once we start doing that, now we have a choice, right? Now we decide what to do. And so now you want to think about what's your own participation in your civic life, in the political structures, in government. Most of you, according to the research and from 12 years of teaching at Kingsborough, I've talked to many students, thousands of students. And so I know some of the barriers that are influencing your decisions not to act against injustice or inequality, right? We've talked about it. And so you want to think about those and see how can you get out of those patterns? What can I do to help you, right? What can Kingsborough do to help you? What can others do to help you? And then think about, so what is the purpose of a college education then, right? It's not just to get you a good job. Hopefully it will do that, right? But hopefully also it'll help you engage more in these big problems and help you actually, be successful in your life beyond just a job. And then what can you do? Start thinking about what you can do once you're in the career to start working against injustice. Many students tell me that this is their whole entire reason for going into either the field of law or into policing, is that they want to make a difference in their communities. And so don't think that's going to happen automatically because you get a degree in a job, right? You're going to have to learn how to do that in order to actually achieve that goal. So now we have to think about, okay, so how do the judges reinforce inequality? Well, the first thing is that there's this concept called originalism. And so you read that in the text reader and it gives you the argument that these judges give for why they think they're doing the right thing. And you want to look at their reasons, right? But understand that there's different points of view. Not everybody takes that point of view. So Justice Breyer had a concept called active liberty. Justice Ginsburg had a concept called the living Constitution, right? There's lots of different ways of interpreting the Constitution. So originalism isn't what it is, right? It's a choice that these 6 individuals on the current Supreme Court are making. But they do have differences, and it's important to understand those. So let's see how those work out. Judges sometimes write this thing called concurrences. So even though all 6 of them voted on the same side, they're saying, but we have different reasons for why we did it. So those are important, right, to read. So when we take the Dobbs case, which the majority, written by Alito up on the upper right here, Justice Alito, he wanted to get rid of the whole right to abortion. He said there is no right to an abortion. It's not in our nation's history or culture. It's not in the Constitution, and so it's gone, right? And that's the majority opinion. But Roberts said, okay, I agree that there shouldn't be a woman's right to have an abortion after viability, but here's what he says, right? He says, but there's probably still should be a woman's right to choose because previous cases said there was. So he doesn't want to overrule all those cases, but he wants to limit it. He says it should be far enough so that there's a reasonable opportunity to choose, but it doesn't have to go all the way to viability, right? Now, of course, this is opinion, but this is what he's saying. He believes that the previous cases in the constitutional law allow. So he thinks that the rest of the court went too far. right? They obviously very strongly write that they think he didn't go far enough, right? So you see, they're all originalists. They're all asking this idea, well, what would the founders do? Which some of us, me included, think that's kind of a ridiculous question, but it's okay if you think that. Everybody has to have their own interpretation strategy, right? But I think it's ridiculous, by the way, because they're dead, right? So I don't speak to dead people. But some people think that they can figure out what the founders meant. Okay, well, that's their job, right? As long as they explain their reasons, then okay, they're doing legal reasoning. Might not be scientific reasoning, but it's legal reasoning, and that's what this class is about. We see the same kind of difficulty here again with Justice Barrett on the lower right. Where she says, well, the majority said that the Secretary of Education cannot forgive student loans, even though Biden and the Secretary of Education said, well, we thought Congress told we could, right? And that's how they read the congressional law. But the court says, no, we think you read it wrong. And she says, it's because of this thing called the major questions doctrine, but she disagrees with her other 5 originalists, and she says, I think it's more about context. And so when we interpret what's called a delegation, so when Congress gave the power to the Secretary of Education to forgive student loans, she's saying we can't interpret a statute, for all it could be or what, the best situation. We have to do what a reasonable person would do. Now, notice that both of these judges are using this word reasonable, right? Yet they don't define what reasonable is. So where would we get this definition of reasonable from? The correct answer is from previous cases, right? There is a reasonable person standard that is established through legal cases. And so it's not you, it's not me, it's not the economics definition of reasonable or the prudent person. It's defined by previous cases. So that's like another layer of interpretation. Right? And so you see all this disagreement. I really want to show you this, first of all, because this is the majority of Supreme Court. So this is what we're going to keep seeing in all of these cases. The originalists are in charge right now. But I want you to see, this is, sometimes the media makes it sound like it's thumbs up or thumbs down, right? The judges ruled for or against. That's not what happens. And once you start reading the cases, you'll realize they're way more complicated. It's not just one side versus the other, right? Because as you see, there's 6 of them and they don't always agree with each other, even if they rule the same way. And it's not like you like it or dislike it, which of course is a social media reference. So there's also big questions that people are trying to figure out. Lawyers, judges, politicians, women, advocates. Who decides when the right to choose begins and ends? If you've got 5 Supreme Court justices saying there is no right to choose, and you've got 1 Supreme Court justice saying you can choose between X time and Y time, but he doesn't tell you what those times are. And then you've got 3 justices who are saying this is ridiculous. Of course you have a right to choose whenever you want. And then you've got hundreds of millions, or you've got millions of Americans, saying one thing. You've got millions of Americans. Who decides, right? Who gets to decide these questions? These are all open questions that don't have easy answers. So we want to think about how on earth did we get here, right? How did the courts have this power to just decide, right, whether a woman has a choice, literally, right? They say you don't have a choice. That's what Alito says. And 4 of the justices agree with him, and 1 says, well, I only partially agree, and 3 disagree. Well, I gave you a series of cases here which really deal with this issue called sovereignty. And so, how do judges think about things? Well, this is a great picture in my opinion. I mean, it's not a great picture, right? But it shows us what's going on here. The judges are influenced by each other, and they're influenced by previous judges. And so this kind of thing repeats itself because you'd have to have judges who, first of all, look different than these guys, but also who have different opinions and different experiences. And as so long as that doesn't happen, then you're going to keep getting the same thing. And so as you see in the sovereignty cases, the power is given, the Supreme Court takes the power to decide what the other branches of government can and can't do, and what the limitations are, and what they shouldn't do. And so you get a line of cases like this because they call it a precedent, right? And so when you see that word precedent, that this is what they mean. They don't just mean previous cases, they mean the previous judges that made those cases. And now you should see that precedents aren't always good, right? Sometimes they're quite evil, and sometimes they're quite unjust, right? Depending on your point of view. But even sometimes judges down the road say, we made a mistake. So Justice Roberts thinks that Korematsu, for example, was a mistake. Several judges think that the Plessy versus Ferguson case was a mistake. However, several judges think it wasn't a mistake. They believe in segregation, right? Several judges believe that Korematsu was the right decision, right? Interning Japanese people was the right thing to do, they believe. So it's the same thing here, right? Many people believe that in Trump versus Hawaii, if the government says that people from Yemen are a threat to national security, the court said, who are we to decide whether that's true? Now notice, isn't that crazy, right? Just one slide ago, they have opinions on whether the Secretary of Education can forgive student loans. So the court, right, apparently has more information about student loans than the Secretary of Education, right? I'm being sarcastic. Or they can decide whether a woman can choose to get an abortion. But they say we can't decide whether people from Yemen pose a threat because they're Muslim. We can't touch that. We're going to leave that up to the Department of Defense and the executive branch, right? And so they do that because, well, we did that before. In Johnson versus McIntosh, we decided we can't tell American Indian people what to do, but we can say that they're not in charge of their own property, right? So they make these kind of deals with each other on what they can and can't do. And you see the same thing as well in Chisholm and Korematsu, where they decide, whether they're going to interfere with the government or not. And so now you see this as a line of cases that creates these situations. So now you want to go back to week 1, and I put in a quote by Thurgood Marshall, who argued the Brown versus Board of Education case and then became a Supreme Court justice. I want you to think about, start looking at the cases where judges take the side of the person who's saying, my rights were violated, give me my rights, and compare those to when the judges take the other side, where they're saying, I'm sorry, we don't think you have that right. Start thinking about the actual reasons that they're providing, not just the outcome in the case. Look at the reasons and try to make sense of it. Now, it might be offensive to you, right? You might say, well, these people are crazy. True, right? You can have that opinion, but you want to know in what ways, right? Because in what ways are those comments, those sentences that they're writing, are those going to reappear in future cases? A lot of people were surprised about the Dobbs versus Jackson case, but I've been teaching that Roe will be overturned for the last 12 years. And so I've been preparing students by helping them analyze the cases, and those students should be prepared that day. They said, well, of course it was overturned because we learned how to critically analyze the case, because look at these sentences in these previous cases that are going to show up in a future case as soon as the majority decides, right? As soon as the majority changes. And so these are things that you can start to analyze and understand within criminal justice when you start looking at these reasons that the judges give. Now, you want to think again also about the consequences, right? So when they're having competing meanings of constitutional principles, think about who benefits, who suffers or who's excluded, and who continues to dominate, and specifically how. What structures do they use? How do they use police? How do they use the court system? How do they use corrections? How do they use the political system? And then start to look at the examples of how people organize and resist those, and start looking at what tools do they use. So how versus how in that situation. Now, your discussions so far have been great, right? So you've showed the tension between social control and resistance strategies, and I've pulled just a few examples here. And you've done it by referring to the reader and giving good examples and explaining those. You've shown competing judicial interpretations of sovereignty. I'm going to get into how complicated that is in a second, right? So one of the most under-examined concepts within American government and law, right? We just take the idea that we're all sovereign, right? We all say, oh, of course I'm sovereign. I get to make all my own decisions. I'm free. And then other days we say, I don't get to do anything. The government is all sovereign. They have all the power, right? Or another day we say, well, all the corporations have the power. Or, during COVID we say, all the doctors have the power. See how many people we make sovereign in any given week, right? We're constantly changing our ideas about what is sovereignty and who gets it. So this relates back to the civic education gap, right? Depending on what people know about the system and how much knowledge they have about these processes and the hows and the reasons that are given, if you don't know much, you don't have much power, right? You don't have many tools. The more you know and the more you're able to learn, the better off you're going to be, right? So what we start to see over time, and there's more than this, but two very common ways of looking at it, are that lots of people see the Constitution or constitutional law as a project, right? It's not real. It's like an idea that people have, and it's, you know, based in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, right? All these big concepts where they say, well, we're marching towards freedom, right? They're not wrong. This is what they believe, right? It's not totally accurate, right? On the other hand, other people see it as a formal document that limits freedoms, and they say, well, of course you're free, right? Once you're basically able to feed yourself and defend yourself, you're free. You can choose to do what you want. But because we live in a society, we've given up those freedoms, and now you have to, you know, lose your power. Well, that doesn't, you know, that's partially true, but it's not totally true either. And so there must be lots of different ways of seeing the Constitution in real life. And so you're seeing how this plays out in this course. So now we want to start thinking about, well, what about not just you, right? So we've got 63 responses, which is about three semesters of students, because, you know, we're limited to 25 students per semester, and not everybody completes the assignments, if you can believe it. So look who you have made sovereign, right? You do it just like each semester. So on the one hand, you know, you want professors, the purple here, to determine the final grade. So I'm the sovereign. Thank you very much. I love being the king. But what does that tell you about your ideas of domination? Aren't I dominating you then? You're just submitting to my domination, and I get to decide whatever is happening? Do you have any room for resistance? Is there anything you can do? Are there any processes that you can find in the syllabus or in the student handbook that suggests that you have more power than you're giving on here? The other one you look at is, you know, on the other hand, when you think about the term more broadly, you're all over the place, right? Just like every other American. Some of you want to be completely free. Others of you want to be in voluntary groups. Others of you believe in the representative system. You probably vote. Other people's believe that, you know, the people you vote for have a certain allegiance to you, but you don't have to care about the other people, right? Some of you believe that groups are free. And so there's all these different competing ideas. This is super important because now you should see clearly whose rules are we talking about when we say law is a rule, right? Which group, which belief system, which one is prevailing here? And so it's not that simple. This is always in competition with each other. You also want to start to think about, how can I be more proactive in my life now that I know that I do have some agency, I do have some power, I can resist. I don't just have to give my sovereignty to the professor. There are systems in which I can appeal grades. I can go through the process of getting access to different resources. I can talk to professors who are trying to equalize the power relations. So then you want to look back at the discussion board statements from week 1 and look at yours and see, now that you've learned over the last 3 weeks, come back and say, okay, what was I saying I was going to try to do? How does this relate to where I'm going? But also then look at the similarities and differences of the other students, right? You'll see that some have much more ambitious ideas. Some of you have much more humble ideas. Some of you are very practical. Some of you are more idealistic, right? And so this all helps you understand the process of making constitutional law in everyday life. So we also want to think back about week 1 and remember why we can't wait, right? If we want justice to be equal, if we're all here because as criminal justice majors and legal scholars, we're saying we would like the system to be better, well, let's think back, well, what did Dr. King say, right? Anytime, a single instance, one time, that justice is denied, let's say to a person of color, because they were wrongly accused and convicted, because they were shot in the street when they were unarmed, because they were denied access to voting, right? Anytime, if it happens once, then none of us have justice, right? Which is a very, very smart way of understanding that this is a system, right? So if one part of the system is sick, the whole system is sick. And so we have to get rid of the myth that there's justice as long as somebody doesn't have it. Once everyone has justice, and remember, it's socially produced, it's not natural, it doesn't just happen, right? People actually have to do it. Once everybody is making sure that everybody gets justice, okay, now you can say you have an equal law, right? That law is now equal for everyone. But we also want to think about what Dr. Patricia Hill Collins said, right? She said, the reason, think about it this way, right? King is saying we have to organize and people have to come together and they have to fight for justice, right? They have to struggle towards it. Patricia Hill Collins, Dr. Collins is saying, well, let's think about why groups don't do that. right? And part of it is because they're not listened to by their teachers, right? By their religious leaders, by politicians, by their bosses, right? And so this is where we get the idea of learning how to think critically and write critically, which you learn in college, having the power to use your own voice, which you can learn in college, but you can learn in lots of other places too. And then learning how to resist and struggle and organize together, which I know it sounds a little bit silly, but you kind of are getting a little bit of this through the discussion board, right? By learning how to talk to each other, encourage each other, critically analyze what each other is saying, listening to what other people are saying from their point of view, and commenting on it, right? Putting your point of view into the conversation. This is like the basic first step of doing that in real life, right? Of organizing. And if this were in person, we'd be doing more of that kind of thing. So we're almost done here, and so what we're trying to do here is understand that we all, each of us, come from social language worlds. Now, me and my sister come from a similar social language world, but she's a nurse, right? So she's got a different vocabulary, different understanding, and different experiences than I do, right? So that is true of our families, our friends, our co-workers, our fellow students, right? So each person kind of has, they're not wildly different, right? Everybody is going to live and die. Everybody has to eat food, right? Everybody has to have water. Everybody needs a house, right? Or a place to live. We have certain things in common, but we experience those things in common differently. And so you want to start to think about, once we start seeing patterns, how do certain groups, social, racial, ethnic, political, religious, gender, sexuality, class, right? All of these things, different ways of seeing groups, how do they experience the world more similar to each other and more differently? How does law enforcement see you and other people every day? How do you see them, right? And I don't mean this idealistically or abstractly. I mean this every day, right? Every day. When you see a law enforcement officer, how do you see them? How do you think about them? What are the thoughts that come to mind, right? It's not the same for all of you. It's not the same for me. Then we can start to look at data and statistics to see, well, how do they see other people? How do they see people of color? How do they see women? And so you can start to understand that. Then you want to start to think about how different these ideas are when it comes to these concepts of right and wrong, legal, illegal, justice, injustice, domination, resistance, right? There's competing definitions, and so you need to learn what those are. And you need to decide where do you stand. And so what we call this is the polyvocality of legality, right? Very complicated phrase, but it's got a reason why it is, right? Legality is the narratives, the stories people tell about law. So you've got stories you tell about law. We call those legality, right? Slightly easier than saying stories about law. Poly is many, right? Numbers, lots of people. And vocality is voices. So there's lots of ways of vocalizing or talking about your narratives, your stories of law. So lots of people talk about law in lots of different ways. That's kind of a way of thinking about it. You can get the official definition in the reader. So if we review all of these things from week 1 and week 2, we see that inequality is produced. It's not natural. It doesn't just happen, right? People participate in it, and you're either participating in inequality or you're participating to resist inequality. Domination is the status quo. So things aren't neutral, things aren't fair, things aren't equal, right? Inequality is the norm. That's the thing that is constantly going on. That process forces minoritized racial and ethnic groups to organize and resist, right? So they're not doing it because they want to, they're doing it because they have to, because they're being pushed. So oftentimes we say they are up against the law, right? The law is coming at them, and so they have to learn how to resist and organize it against it, those injustices, right? To use a different side or a different way of thinking about the law. Now, the dominant narrative also marginalizes people based on how much money they have access to. I think many of you know this, right? That depending on how much money is, what kind of lawyer you're going to have, whether you have access to the court system, who's going to listen to you, right? What you need to do to be able to take care of your family if you are accused of something. What resources they have, how much do they know, how many friends do they have that can help them, how many lawyers do they know, how they love, right? How people actually experience love and how they go through life, right? Has a huge effect on marginalization and whether they're able to experience life in an equal way. And the same thing goes for gender labels. Now that narrative also, says, we like to say it's fair and equal, but that's not a scientific fact. And the more you study especially if you go to John Jay, right, you're going to find there are many examples of that's not true. But it's a story that maintains inequality, right? It has a purpose. That story about equality is what masks or hides inequality, and it gets people to think, well, you're just complaining or you're just being a whiner, instead of actually having them look at the statistics and realizing they might have to make a change. There's bias in the courts, law enforcement, and corrections, and those are socially produced. They're not natural, right? Those are people choosing and participating in a system of inequality because that's the status quo. That's the normal situation. So it's going to cost you something to go against it. And so for some people, that's not something they are willing to do. They enjoy the benefits of inequality. The Supreme Court has historically sided against rights more often than they've sided for people who want their rights. So it's not surprising because they reflect the social inequality in the rest of the system. Remember, if one part of the system is sick, so is the rest of the system. And so we can't expect the Supreme Court to just fix every problem because they haven't done that historically. Very rarely have they even gone against inequality and injustice. And even in those situations, it has not changed everything. It's made some changes, and it's been able to largely change the story that people have, but it hasn't made a system more equal. The constitutional legal system was built for keeping inequality by those who had land, slaves, and money, and they wanted to keep it, right? So this system that we exist in was not designed for us. Groups are stronger and more persuasive than individuals. So when those who experience injustice organize into groups, they are more likely to influence legal, political, and criminal justice systems. Narratives of equality, waiting, and getting a career later, that's when you're going to make change. Those are making you less likely to resist injustice and more vulnerable to experience injustice. And so you need a story that's going to tell you, I'm going to start now and I'm going to learn how to do it so that I'm prepared when I get into my career not to experience injustice, and if I do, how to resist it. So this is kind of an intro of week 2 so that you have a better idea of what you're expected to do, and I gave you some examples of what you're doing well and what you should focus on. And so I look forward to continuing to read your answers, and if you need to, again, reach out to me and we can talk over Zoom, or if there's anything else you need, right, you can email me.